so all of that experience working with these startup disruptive companies have brought me to verified clinical trials. And what we're doing over here is extremely unique. It's not like we're digitizing a paper process or anything along those lines. We've created a process to make sure that, well, actually, what we're doing is we're confirming a research participant's eligibility based upon their research history, which has been a gap in the clinical research industry. And so, with all that being said, yeah, working at startup companies has been my entire career, and it's set me up for verified clinical trials as their chief commercial officer.
Very good. And I guess give me a little bit of insights in terms of some of the key challenges that you faced in the position of chief commercial officer at Verified Clinical Trial.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think the biggest challenge is lack of awareness in terms of what we do because we are creating a process. Really, what we do is we're preventing professional and duplicate research participants from entering clinical trials, and I think it's somewhat unimaginable for pharmaceutical companies and sponsors to think that a research participant would enroll into a clinical trial multiple times. There is still a very wide disconnect between what happens at the sponsor level and what happens at the site level. Um, and thinking that somebody's going to take this investigational product multiple times, either for financial gain or out of desperation because they're concerned about being in the placebo cohort, or lack of drug supply. Uh, it's something that you can't really imagine happening, but it is. And so I think the toughest part is education. The second most difficult part is that our technology gets stronger with more sponsors and research sites using our technology because we have the ability to prevent cross sponsor, cross phase, cross therapeutic area dual enrollment. And we've definitely hit that critical mass now over the past 10 years that we've been in business. But it was a tough and bumpy road to kind of convince all of these sponsors to run every one of their participants through our technology to make sure whether or not they're eligible. So I would say those are the two most difficult and rewarding, um, difficult challenges, but rewarding because we're seeing everything come to fruition now. So
So if you were a participant in a clinical trial, I mean, I have not been, right? I've certainly seen this from the outside, but just curious to walk the path just a little bit with you to try and understand this a little bit better. So if you were a participant in a clinical trial, let's say you enrolled, in some cancer, um, clinical trial, and you don't know yet whether or not if you are accepted into that clinical trial, but you enroll in multiple clinical trials. Now all of a sudden you get accepted to one, um, and the second one comes along. I'm assuming that there's some way to opt out of that, second clinical trial. Is that right?
yeah, so I mean, again, it really depends. The What we've been able to identify, having supported tens of thousands of clinical trials now, is there's three participant personas within the research space. There is the deceptive research participant. So those participants that are going from site to site, study to study for that financial gain. And this is definitely more prevalent within certain therapeutic areas, such as vaccine, where they're looking for healthy volunteers, um, or areas like obesity or hypercholesteremia, where the inclusion exclusion criteria is so similar to so many other studies that are taking place, where you could just get into the clinical trial, you get these stipends, which are pretty significant, and you don't take the drug. Um, and then you've got your desperate research participants. So oncology, Alzheimer's disease, where you may have been diagnosed with a death sentence essentially. And so you're concerned about being in that placebo cohort. And if you're just as an example, if you're in a mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease study and you don't feel any change in your behavior or something along those lines, there's other options that are out there. There's a lot of sponsors that are targeting the same research participant, and you could just jump to another clinical trial, and you're not going to let the first clinical trial know that you're going to another clinical trial because that's that's exclusionary criteria. You sign an informed consent form that says that you will not enroll into multiple clinical trials at once. But if you're desperate, you're going to do what you got to do. So
Got it.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a bunch
Yeah. I
of
mean,
well, but yeah, those are two that we see quite often.
yeah, not a world that most of us, have to be in unless you're in this space like you or
Right.
as a participant. So that helps. So can you explain a little bit more about the mission and the main objectives of verified clinical trials and how your role contributes?
Yeah, absolutely. Our main priority is to enhance patient safety, data quality, and study integrity. Um, in every single clinical trial, it specifically says that a participant cannot be dual enrolled in multiple clinical trials at once. They can't be violating a previous study's washout period. Many times in the exclusion criteria of a protocol, it says a participant cannot have had prior investigational product exposure or needs to be naive to the compound. And without having a solution in place during the screening process to confirm whether or not that participant is in another clinical trial or violating a previous study's washout period, there's no defense against it. A research site has no way to confirm whether or not that participant is in another clinical trial. I mean, when you think about what happens at a research site, if you need to know how much a participant weighs, use a scale. If you need to know their temperature, you use a thermometer. If you need to know their health history, you use electronic medical records. But when they need to know whether or not the participant is involved in another clinical trial, literally all that the site does is ask that research participant. And if they say no, they take their word as face value. And so it's an outdated model, which is proven to be unsuccessful. Studies have failed specifically due to this reason. And so our goal is to implement an additional step in the screening process to confirm whether or not they're eligible. And again, the mission is to enhance patient safety, data quality, and study integrity.
So I have to assume that you have some way of verifying who somebody is and more or less, figure out whether or not they've enrolled in other things. But is it as simple as just knowing who somebody specifically is, or is it something more complex than that?
On the surface level, it seems like it might be somewhat simple to just know whether or not that participant is involved in multiple studies, but due to privacy laws and regulations, and which are even more strict in Europe with GDPR, it's actually quite difficult. So it's not just a participant going into a registry. Um, there's a lot of rules and regulations surrounding what can be entered. The participant has to consent to going into the registry, but they're also associated with a specific protocol. So we know whether or not that participant has been involved in the phase 2. And now, if they're screening for the phase 3 and part of that exclusion criteria says they can't have had prior IP exposure, they wouldn't actually be eligible for that study. So it is quite complex behind the scenes, um, but but very easy for a research site to enter that participant into our database, and then all the heavy lifting is done on the back end.
Very good. So what are some of the more significant partnerships or collaborations that you have at Verified Clinical Trials, and how have they benefited the company?
So we are therapeutic area agnostic. Our main client or customer is the pharmaceutical sponsor that's running and essentially paying for the clinical trial. So we're working with, I'd say, 50% of the top 20 currently right now, where they've realized that this is a gap historically in their screening process, and now they're implementing us across our portfolio of studies. I'd say another really strong strategic partner of ours is with Velocity Clinical Research. Velocity Clinical Research is the largest wholly owned research site network in the world with over 100 research sites globally. And they've implemented our technology across all of their sites, across every single one of their studies to prevent this issue of professional and dual enrollment. And then there's also some other technology partners that we're speaking to about integrating and just reducing the number of technology that the sites need to use, because there is that site technology fatigue that goes on. So Creo, for example, is a company that we're looking to collaborate with, who is a disruptive technology